bloodstains the corpse-pale innards of neglected gourds judged unworthy of Halloween porch displays. Beams of light, like agitated fireflies, move with the flicked wrists of every police officer who's come too late to save Cornsilk Sally's victims. From the corner of his tired eyes, Sheriff Jones spots her in a tattered, dusty dress, watching between the rows of corn. "Stop!" But she's gone. The sound of her skirt sewn from corn silk brushing against the yellowed husks serves as her retort. Number 2. Cornsilk Sally teaches the worst girls in school about revenge. Brianna and Caden watch from under the loose hay. The damp strands now reek with the tangy odor of bloodletting. Believing the violence over, they recall Cornsilk Sally placing a finger against chapped lips, her damaged nail like a lit, black-flamed candle. The darkness danced in the girl's eyes, ready to spread. They climb off the creaking trailer, avoiding the hollowed-out chest cavity of Annie Previtt, the pumpkin patch's owner. Her eyes are forever opened wide, asking, "What did I do?" The girls know. The girls always know. Number 3. Cornsilk Sally and the All Hallows Grieving. Gam Gam's tears dry on fallen leaves. Her body trembles, sobs like small earthquakes tearing her apart. When she stands, bare feet crunch eggshells into the grass. Toilet paper soaked red with blood dangles from the front porch eaves. She stops short, peering up at Sweet Sally's room. No lights appear there. No candle burns on the windowsill. Her not-so-friendly neighbors watch, judging her from a safe distance. Many don't understand what the women in her family are capable of, and those who know aren't in a position to share. Number 4. Cornsilk Sally, Trick or Die. The costume-wearing children stand beneath the willows, spilling candy on the lawn. From surrounding houses, screen doors slam, and heavy feet stomp onto porches. Names drift down shaded streets. Benji, Sarah, Antoine, Leah, Carl. On and on. No children turn from their vigil. Perhaps if those parents, drenched in panic sweat, wondering why their children's beds sit empty, called for ghost, witch, cowboy, cat, devil, maybe then they would be answered. Finally, someone's father, wearing flannel pajamas and fuzzy slippers, grabs a child and asks, "What are you doing here?" "Cornsilk Sally's gonna die," they answer. Number 5. Cornsilk Sally and the Harvest Dance with the Devil. "Come dance under the full moon, Sally," the devil says. Sally wipes blood off her face, picking dirt from long black hair. Something rubbery wet comes loose as she brushes out debris. Principal Martinez's eyeball. Sally smirks, recalling the sound her hand scythe had made, wedging, freeing, twisting the orb from its socket. The devil clears his throat, offering a hand. He never introduced himself as the devil, but Sally knows without needing a name. Stray dogs howl behind them. The music swells, approaching the grand finale. The devil whispers, "Here's to a new beginning." Number 6. Cornsilk Sally's. Deputies keep away from Sheriff Jones, leaving him to moan over the body of his only son. Jordan Jones, varsity football captain, lies across the ground like a tattered costume. But there's no one to slip on his skin and ring doorbells singing, "Trick or treat." Instead, they search for Cornsilk Sally, a.k.a. Sally Perkins, a.k.a. the sophomore witch. Radios chirp. Dispatch puts through anyone who's seen a pale girl with black hair, a dress made of corn silk, and a hand scythe trailing blood. No way all reports are true. No way she's in so many places at once. Number 7. Cornsilk Sally, Trick or Die 2, The Trickening. Heavy downpour washes fresh blood down storm drains into the overgrown grass of ditches bordering small-town front lawns. Winds, thunder, and rapid lightning crashes drown grief-stricken howls in the final moans of dying children. Tiny broken bodies bleed while dark clouds pass over the harvest moon. The siren on Sheriff Jones's cruiser drones on, waiting for someone to smash the glass, reach over the sheriff's ruined shotgun-blasted face and switch it off. Until then, The neighborhood listens to electronic screams as red and blue lights pass over the living and dead alike. Number 8. Corn Silk Sally's Hayride to Hell. They tear her handmade corn silk dress, rough and smooth hands alike, dirt under some nails and others manicured to idealize perfection. Her classmates leave her bare beneath the harvest moon, bleeding within and without, her eyes closed, dreaming. She opens them, hot with fire. Except this already happened. Back on the hayride, she steals a glance at Mr. QB himself, Jordan Jones. She picks out the school gossips whispering farther back on the trailer. Sally wonders what they'll say when the night ends. Everyone's already dead, though. Why do these things keep happening to me? Number 9. Corn Silk Sally, another origin story about revenge. Gam never talked to Sally about the girl's daddy. Never told her what Sheriff Jones, then nothing more than quick-to-anger, ambitious Deputy Jones, did to the misunderstood man, Gam's baby boy. She didn't talk about rinsing the girl's corn silks and enchanted oils before feeding them into the sewing machine, stitched with needles hexed to prick the skin, the corn silk drinking her blood. She loves the girl, her sweet grandbaby, but she loves her boy more. She'll have her vengeance, even if it means destroying her line, the sheriff's, and everyone else's besides. Number 10. Corn Silk Sally in Space. Sally, not the same Sally as before, but close enough, wishes on a dead Earth. The field trip rockets left. Classmates locked her in the corn silo during boarding, but she's high enough to touch the dome around her lunar colony home. Ears of space-grown corn shuck themselves, revealing golden silk mid kernels off-white like rotten teeth. A shooting star, she falls. Her dark hair covers the explosions of pain behind her eyes. A blade waits by her injured hand, sickle-shaped, a crescent moon. Shadows fall, forming a mask, an appropriate costume for the next Halloween party. I got a quick other one for you all. This one is called Lost Boy Found in His Bear Suit. 3 days after he went missing in the woods, they found the boy alive. He was sticky with wild honey and chunks of salmon were smeared around his lips. The fuzzy collar of his teddy bear jumpsuit, the only outfit he'd wear to bed, was worn and matted. But he was alive, and that's what mattered. His parents were supposed to wait back at the makeshift command center the authorities established at the 4-H center. But after a restless night spent holding hands across the gap between 2 cots made up with army surplus sheets, they weren't going to wait behind. Don't be surprised if he looks different. Being out in these woods for that long, at his age, Park Ranger Steve told them. The boy played with leaves on the forest floor as his parents approached with the park ranger. One of the EMTs had pushed the jumpsuit's hood, with its teddy bear ears, off his head. The boy turned at the sound of shoes crunching through the underbrush. He smiled, his mouth open wide with the effortless enthusiasm only small children can achieve. Reheated coffee stung his mother's esophagus before passing through her pale, chapped lips. Pain inside her mouth and horror inside her head drove the woman to her knees. Unsure of whose comfort to prioritize, the father rubbed her shoulders but kept staring over at his boy. The now crying child looked more like an abandoned plaything than the dimpled sprite who'd kissed his stubbly cheeks and called him Dadu. The boy pulled the hood back up. The fabric cast a shadow over his face, coating his eyes in a bottomless black. After the EMTs and Park Ranger Steve got everyone calmed, they explained to the boy's parents that the wriggling white worms falling from his smiling mouth weren't maggots. They were grubs, larvae. Hell if we know how we got to him. Somewhat reassured, the boy's parents walked over and scooped him up in their arms. He was theirs once again, their little lost boy found in his bear suit. Each tried to find a tiny hand inside the stitched-on paw coverings at the ends of his sleeves. But he growled, teeth snapping, and pulled his hands back further into his mud-caked fuzzy outfit. He wriggled and squirmed in their arms. He seemed stronger than they'd been told to expect. The boy broke free and fell the short distance from their grasp to the ground. He landed on padded feet and ran. Everyone sprinted to catch up with him. His parents ran that much harder than the others, perhaps fearing they wouldn't find him again if they let him run too far. But he eventually stopped. After pushing aside some broken branches, they found him, standing by a dark cave entrance. A slight breeze pushed the bear ears down against the top of the hood. "She's sleeping now." Flashlight at the ready, Park Ranger Steve nodded toward the cave entrance. He'd already seen the scat, the bones, and bits of hair as they'd made their approach. He'd heard the stories from the older rangers, the ones about an old bear sow whose cubs were killed out of season by some hunters. Campfire tales said she'd take human children to even the score. But that story had been around for ages, details changing with every retelling. The old mama bear, if she'd ever lived at all, would be long dead. Then again, the cave was right there. The boys' parents shook their heads. It was their call, and they didn't want to know what was inside. They only wanted their boy back home, away from the cave, away from the woods. They returned to the Jeep. The boy passed out almost immediately and slept between his parents in the back seat. They wrapped him in a foil rescue blanket, ignoring the tightness of his stretched thin skin and the stiff black and brown hairs growing out from under the scrapes and scratches on his tiny body. The Jeep's engine growled, then roared. Its tires threw dirt and rocks behind them. Its tracks, like claw marks, were left to show that they'd been there.
I get to torture you, sit.
Oh, fantastic.
This is my favorite part. Hi, I'm Katrina. I get to interview Patrick today. The first thing I want to tell you is that I was very excited that you read Corn Silk Sally, because that is my favorite story in the whole collection.
Awesome.
Because I have a very particular fondness for revenge stories. And I think that it's really interesting that revenge stories sort of find a foothold in the horror canon. Do you think there's a particular reason for that, or is it just because we like, vicious things?
I think it's everyone that likes horror is all a little weird, probably a little picked on, and so the idea of revenge is never too far from people's minds. I think it's also, it's kind of like, the story here is a little bit of a slasher story, and so much of like the slasher mythos and the things that you see in the movies are revenge based. Like somebody's been wrong, and then there's this need to right this wrong. I think it's kind of a very like basic story, and one that really resonates with people. And horror is so much about emotion that when you have something, a plot that's very emotional and driven by emotion, then that tends to resonate with people.
Yeah, I think you're right. And do you think that maybe, like, talk a little bit about your collection as a whole? Do you think that basis of emotion is something that inspired a lot of the stories in here, or did they all just come from different places?
It's a little, basically, so there's a lot of, if you look at the description on the front flap of the hardcover, it says like this is a collection of weird dark stories and millennial anxieties. And the millennial anxieties angle was really sort of the driving force for a lot of these stories. There's a lot of stories about home ownership, or starting a family, or having, growing older and reevaluating your relationships with your parents, kind of growing older, growing up, having kids, dealing with the fears that go into these kind of like early experiences for people. So that was kind of the overarching theme that I went into the collection with, and taking a bunch of stories that I'd had published. I think it's a mix of 15 published previously, and then 3 or 4 original, or something like that. I'm terrible with math, but that's why I'm a writer.
Yes,
and so, and I looked at the stories that I had and sort of looked at sort of some additional pockets, and has kind of 4 subcategories that I group the stories into. Mm-hmm. So there's the first group of stories are very family horror based, or like found family or real family, depending. Then it moves into sort of violence in media, and violence in sort of like the way that we consume violence, and the way, riffing on some like violence that we see on TV and movies and things like that, and going into like supernatural horror. Mm-hmm. And then finally at the end is sort of like this slasher horror, which is really kind of, and so I tried to at like the juncture when the topic would go to the next one, tried to like have a story that would be like, this one's about family and about TV, or this one's about TV and it's a little supernatural, or it's a little supernatural. And so I try to have that, basically like wanted to have an experience for readers when they're looking at it, that you can read this from story number 1 to the last story, and you'll get like kind of a smooth process. But if you want to read it out of order, also fine by me.
So like a human centipede of stories.
Kind of a human centipede of stories, just hopefully not
Cool.
spreading as much
Awesome.
crap
Ew.
between.
Okay, moving on. Okay. That's my own fault. So it's interesting that you said it was about what is it, millennial anxieties, because because that's not straight up. So that description is not in my copy of the book, but I did kind of pick up on a theme of feeling out of control in this particular collection. So it's really interesting to me that those two kind of go hand in hand, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these stories were sort of ones that, as I'm now in my 40s, and then sort of looking back at my 20s and my 30s, and this sort of evolution that goes on when you are learning about new things to be afraid of, and having like these new fears, and you're also conquering old ones, or you're like leaving old ways of life behind and starting these new life. It's scary. There's a lot of incidents like that where it's like you don't necessarily know what's coming next because you've never experienced it. Like, so I've never been a parent until I was, or you never had a home until you do, or done these things until you're doing them, and that's kind of the way. And so a lot of these stories, I think, are also have characters who are in these situations that are new to them: marriage, kids, a new career, or the fading of a career, or transitioning to a new career. And these are those points where you just have to live through these moments, and in the cases of characters, those can have deadly consequences. There's like monsters, so like we don't have to deal with
There's
monsters
just like
most of the time.
monsters and stuff.
There's just like
Yeah.
the killer trees
Yeah.
and things like that, just as it is.
Cool. Okay, so speaking of things to be afraid of, Lost Boy found in his bear suit. My question is, do you have children?
I do.
Okay. How much of fear of children found its way into that story? Because I feel like that story was written by a parent who said, I know that my child is trying to kill me, or there's something inside this child that is going to kill me.
That story came from two places. First, this was while I was a parent, but there was this news story about a child who was lost in the woods, and he had survived for, I think it was like 3 days or 5 days. It seemed like a very remarkable sort of thing, and so I made note of this because he just he ate berries and he did whatever, and so I was like, what if this kid had something else that was protecting him, but also maybe a little sinister? And around the time that I wrote this story, my youngest son wore these fuzzy bear suits.
There it is.
And he was much younger than the child in the story here, but for narrative purposes, I needed somebody who could like talk and move around. But he would only sleep in the bear suit. Like, he would not take it off. We have pictures of him. He would just grow into it as he got bigger, as children do. Keep doing it. And so that kind of came into the story. So pairing those elements, and then it is that notion of, as your child grows and changes, you don't necessarily know who they are or who they're going to be. And dealing with that sort of element of the story, I think, was a kind of like the through line in the tale. There is like figuring out, okay, you don't always have control as a parent. That's one of the first things you learn. Your kid falls off of something, or bumps their head, or they cry, or they hit you for no reason, or they step on you or something. Like, you just there's excuse me, there's all these things you can't control, and so ultimately why not use it for a story?
I agree, 100%. So that kind of reminds me of something that Richard Thomas said in the foreword to this book. He called your horror accessible horror. What does that mean, and do you agree that that's what your work is?
Well, I hope so, because I like people to read my stuff. So it's like accessible is like a good. I'll take it 100%. And I think Richard to me. I've taken a lot of his writing classes, and he's always been somebody who has sort of guided me through the writing world. His collection, Spontaneous Human Combustion, was also out through Turner, and so he connected me with the publisher, which has now led to this book being here. What I try to do with a lot of my stories, and you'll see it, the fact that I'm dealing with, haunted houses or slashers or kind of like creatures from another dimension. What I try to do is like play those beats that people are familiar with, but also try to do something new with it. So, like in the case of the title story in the collection, Pre-Approved for Haunting, is about an investigator who is going to this one house over and over again throughout the course of the story with each owner. And everyone's convinced that it's haunted, but he's not finding any evidence of the actual haunting going on. And it's dealing with this notion of haunting, I don't want to spoil anything, but like dealing with this notion of like being haunted by the future, being haunted by the potential of what's to come, or being haunted by sort of the notion of like potentially lost potential as well. So basically it's like me trying to take these common tropes or common motifs and do something a little bit new and a little bit different with them, if I can.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too, because I think horror is a genre that a lot of times when I'm doing events like this, or just events in general, I get a lot of, well, I don't read horror. Horror is not my thing. And I have to explain to them, no, it definitely is, I promise you. You have to find the right flavor of horror. Horror is like, you have to be a connoisseur a little bit to understand all of its little nuances, and I think you've really accomplished that here. You've gone through all the different flavors of horror in here. So I kind of want to know which one is, not necessarily which story, but what flavor of horror is your favorite, and maybe one that you're not necessarily a super fan of.
I think if I'm going to cheat and just do two for favorites, because they're favorites for different reasons. Like, I'm going to say slasher first. I just, that was what my connection to horror came from. When I was a little kid, I caught a commercial for Child's Play 2 with Chucky, the doll. And it scared me so much that I was terrified of monsters and scary movies. If like a sort of sharp strings were playing in a preview on TV, I would hide behind the couch and tell my parents not to to tell me when the commercial was over so I could come out. And it wasn't until I was maybe in freshman year of high school, I think, summer of freshman year, I had a friend, freshman or sophomore year, had a friend who, we were at the beach, we went to one of those like second run beach movie theaters in North Carolina, and we saw Scream. And Scream was one of those movies where it was smart, it was playing with convention, it was taking these sort of cliches and pointing them out, and that really just like blew my mind. And then I was like, this is great. And then that sort of opened the floodgates to being able to be afraid in the controlled space, which is what I think horror, when it's in fiction, whether it's film, TV, books, etc., what it allows you to do is to be afraid in a safe space, so to speak. And so that really drove me. And so for that reason, I have this soft spot for the slashers, because they are so just, I don't want to say adorable, because it's really not.
No, I think that's a good word. I like adorable for a slasher movie.
It's this notion that like you kind of know what's going to happen. It's like watching sort of like very like broad strokes play or something, and you know what these characters are. You know these stereotypes, these archetypes, and so that's always been one of my favorites. And being able to play in those, because I think you look at somebody like Stephen Graham Jones and the way he does slashers, and the sort of exploring different sides of it that you can do in prose that you can't necessarily do in film. You can go a little bit deeper there. And I also like folk horror, because like I'm basic. Everybody else likes folk horror right now, and it's really fun. It's like leaves and pumpkins and everything.
It's Halloween all the time.
That's Halloween all the time. You gotta love it. And then in terms of like least favorite,
Or you don't even have to be least favorite. Like maybe one that you wouldn't necessarily want to touch in your work, just because it's out there.
I think some of the more extreme horror. I can get gory with the best of them. I can do some of the other things like that. I got
Put that on
gory guts,
your bio. I
gory
can get
guts.
going with
That's
this.
going, going right there on the card.
Yeah.
You know, but some of that stuff where it's just played for shock value
Yeah.
is not necessarily my cup of tea, so to speak. Otherwise, I like to try a little bit of everything. I think that
Yeah.
you go for what the story needs. And so if it's a story that needs a lighter touch, that maybe where the violence is implied, or it's quiet horror, it's more about the emotions. I try to I can play in that wheelhouse. And all right, and if it's something that's more bloody and stabby, then I'm happy to also do that as well. But when it's just like one, and that's the kind of way I like having this collection. Hopefully, what folks will see in it is that different notes, like highs and lows, and sort of like short shocks, and then sort of longer, more meditative pieces as well. And that's just my own preference for horror and fiction. I like having a little bit of everything. I can read. I'm reading like 3 books at home right now, or at a time, because I like to just jump around and have different moods. But I also like to be scared mostly.
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 A little bit of like kissy face is fine.
Yeah,
too,
exactly.
so-
That's fine, man. Every now and then.
Yeah. So I've noticed that a lot in this collection as well. That every story is a little bit different, not just in content, but also the voice is a little bit different in each one, which is really great. I appreciate that in a collection, because then when there are some collections you will read that start to feel kind of samey after a while, and this is definitely not that. So kudos to you on that, because I am not a short story writer. I don't have the patience. Actually, that's not true. I feel like I have too much patience. It always becomes a book by the time I'm done with it. But I also kind of wanted to mention that in at least one story, you kind of experiment with form a little bit. You have one that kind of touches on a screenplay format in pieces. Are there different formats that maybe you wanted to try that you didn't get to include, or maybe something that's going to be coming later that has a little bit of different format, or maybe just something you want to try?
Yeah, I am a big fan of the sort of like epistolary format, so letters. Like Frankenstein is one of my favorite novels of all time, and that sort of has that. Dracula is the same way, but I'm more of a Frankenstein head than a Dracula fan. And so I always like that idea of like playing with the form. And so with I Will Not Read Your Haunted Script, that was actually inspired to start with from a column that was written back in like early 2000s by screenwriters. That was called wrote this column called I Will Not Read Your Fucking Script. And so
I think I read that.
it's a good one. It's a good essay. And then I sort of riffed on that for this. But then I wanted to have this notion of the screenplay sort of coming to life and the character being absorbed into it. And I love those sort of playing with the form that way. I think, for instance, I've got a short story coming out in a collection from Crystal Lake Publishing in December the collection's called Dead Letters, and the story that I wrote is called, it's like the 3 dots when you're waiting for a text message and you see the 3 dots. You just call it ellipses. Call it ... And the story is told all through a series of text message exchanges. And
That sounds intense.
and I like playing with things like that. I'm a big fan also of like the story within a story. As I'm starting to try write some longer things and write some longer pieces, novellas. I've done some novellas, and I'm working on a novel, and got another one in the hopper as well. Playing with that story within a story, because I think so much of what makes us human is like telling stories and like storytelling, and I like to see that reflected in the fiction that I read, because that's how we communicate. Is not necessarily, yes, we have conversations and everything, but like so much of what you remember are the stories that people tell you. So I like to incorporate that, and I like books, and I like stories that incorporate that into the telling of the tale.
I like it. So I am very jealous of your ability to title things, because mine are, I don't come up with my titles.
Okay.
I have other people, much smarter people, who come up with my titles. Mine are always just one word when I hand it over to someone. I'm just unicorn here. Proud But I'm
Love it.
particularly drawn to, and I have to read this because I haven't yet, and I will. Helicopter Parenting in the Age of Drone Warfare.
Yes.
In that title, you know exactly what is going to happen in the story, but you're so drawn in by it, you have to read it anyway. And I find that's the case with a lot of your titles, so I have to know how in the hell do you do that?
I used to work in publishing. That helps.
Okay.
When I was in New York, after I graduated from college in Mississippi, I moved as a southern boy up to New York City, and I got a job in publishing, and eventually ended up in working for Penguin Random House. Right before when it was just Random House, I started, and writing copy, writing titles, coming up with titles for books. Going to title meetings with the editorial and marketing and sales teams, and just sort of throwing out titles over and over and over again, and trying to figure out something that sounds right, but also is going to get people to read it. Very mercenary aspect to it, I know, but at the same time, it's nice to. It's a skill that's helped. Another thing that's helped there is the copy, both the back copy and then like the copy that's the sale copy on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, etc. Largely taken from my query letter for the book. I trying to think like, how am I going to present these stories? What are the highlights? Because you don't want to like overwhelm somebody with like every single detail. You want to give a sense of like, what are the themes? What are a couple stories that are going to stand out? And I don't know whether they just didn't want to do it, or whether they just thought it was like, hey, well, this will work. But I try to think about what's gonna move the needle, basically. And so, if there's anything I can do to help, then I'm happy to do it.
Well, you're a better man than I am. So,
I
okay.
like coming up with them too. It's fun.
Well, talk about the difference then. If you worked in publishing, like, what is it like being on this side? Did you kind of ever picture yourself on this side of the desk, or?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That was the plan.
Yeah. And I'm one of those people, like, it's always interesting to me meeting people who come to writing later in life. They say, I had this job and this job, and then I was like, well, maybe I'll try writing. And I'm like, that's very cool of you. That's awesome. For
Except when they bust out that bestseller.
When they bust out the bestseller, you're like, okay,
yeah.
well, you know what? There's enough pie for everyone.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Right.
And it's something I've wanted to do since I was in the first grade. My mother was a teacher. She's an elementary school teacher and a reading specialist, and my father was a paper salesman. So it was kind of fated in the stars that hopefully I would be a writer someday. And once I learned, probably around the first grade is when I learned, people write these things. People come up with these stories. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. But it's not necessarily wanting to be a character, because you could pretend to be Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, like being the Ninja Turtles, but you could also be the person who came up with the Ninja Turtles. And I thought that was like the coolest thing in the world.
For sure.
And that has stuck with me for, all of life. But then eventually you have parents that say, oh, you have an English degree, you need to get a job. And so you say, well, I don't want to be a lawyer, I don't want to go to med school, so I don't want to do many things. I work in publishing. And then you do, and you work in publishing, and you find out that it's all right, it's okay, it's fine.
Way to dash my dreams, Patrick. Jesus.
It's got some highs and lows, certainly. But what helped for me was we moved here to Minnesota in 2019, and it was a time when I was able to go freelance for a little bit and take some time off from the 9 to 5, 8 to 4 grind.
Just in time, too.
Just in
COVID's right
time.
around the corner.
I really just lucked out there. And I was able to kind of concentrate on writing. So much what I found is like, it's not, you can have a ton of people tell you you're a great writer. You can have your parents, you can have your teachers even, you can have all these people say you're a great writer, but if you don't do it, then it doesn't matter. That's like saying that's whatever. And so I think what helped was having that time to just crank out stories and to submit them and to take classes classes and to grow and to feel comfortable and to come up with a routine that it's harder sometimes to do when you are maybe having a job. You have a day job again, but it's like we live in a different world than pre-COVID, so it's like I spend a lot of time at home, still able to work on writing and everything. And that's what's really helped. I think once you get that sort of boulder rolling down the hill, like, the momentum is there, and I think that's what I've really appreciated, and have family to support me in that, so I really am grateful.
Yeah, I really think there's a formula in that, because I also moved to Minnesota from somewhere else, but I moved in 2012. But I was also in a position where my wife was doing over-the-road trucking, and our kids were very small, so it just made sense for me to stay home. And I stayed home for 2 years, and in those 2 years, I did the same thing you did. I just cranked out a couple of books to get them sent out, because once I started working, once they were older, there was no way to, find the time until you have to find the time. So then, move to Minnesota. That's how
Move to
you
Minnesota.
become a
That
publisher
should be
here.
really just we need more horror writers in Minnesota anyway. So sure, that'll be the new slogan.
So, getting back to the collection, I noticed that there are a couple of stories in here, and I meant to write them down, but I didn't because I'm not prepared.
Alright.
Of that kind of skirt the line between horror and thriller, I think. And that is something that we come across a lot in our genre, where you have books that can either sit on the horror shelf or they can sit on the thriller shelf. And I'm curious to find out, because I ask every horror author I know this, what do you think the difference is between a thriller and a horror?
That's a good question.
This is where the torture begins.
Yeah,
Just thought you should know.
this is we're putting the acetylene torch to my heels here. I think with horror, as I said, there's this emotion that sticks with you after the fact, whereas a thriller is something where you are invested in it as it's happening. You want to see, is this person going to live? Are they going to escape the gunman? Are they going to find out who did the crime or the whatever? With horror, there is that element. I think that's why horror thriller is something that happens a lot of times. You do want to see if they're going to escape the monster. But at the end, what you're left with, I think, is, oh yeah, they escaped the monster, but all their family's dead. All their friends are been eviscerated, and now they have to live with this. They are a changed person, and you as a reader are changed as well. And so that's what I think. When I think of horror, I think of like that lingering sense of being unsettled or upset with the world, your worldview being turned around and turned over.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I find that a lot of people have a very similar sentiment to that. I get a lot of responses that are horror, like thriller is very malleable, I find, but horror has a few things that are kind of tropes, if you want to call them that, but certain aspects to horror that are only in horror, like The Final Girl, for example. You're not going to find anywhere else that is specific to horror only, which is really special to me. I love The Final Girl. That reminds me, I did have to say, I watched Scream for the first time a couple of nights ago.
Oh wow, okay.
Because I'm not a slasher movie kind of person, but I watched not even the whole movie, maybe like a third of it, went to bed and proceeded to have nightmares all night. So I will vouch for that whole slasher thing. It sticks with you.
It does.
And I said I was not going to ask you this, but I do need to know, which is your favorite story in the collection?
Favorite story in the collection.
Which one's your baby?
My baby. Honestly, well, I do love all my word babies.
No.
But
Don't give the dad answer.
The one I think that I want people to read is the last story in the collection, because I want them to read all the other stories and get to the last story in the collection.
Okay,
But also, no, I'm getting to, like, that was the joke part of the answer, but it is the true answer in my heart, because the final story is called the Jalo Kid in the Cataclysms Campground, and it is a story about a brother and sister. The sister is a camp counselor, and the brother is a picked-on camper who, when the story starts, has put a Homer Simpson mask on and killed all of the other counselors, and is about to kill his sister when the apocalypse happens. And this sort of cosmic horror apocalypse, the world is still there, but it's changed. It's different, and they've found themselves, both slasher and final girl, trapped in this like unending campground, this sort of like liminal space campground, and weird stuff is happening, but they cannot leave this setting. The reason why I like the story is, one, it's original to the collection, so it's new for folks if they've read my stuff elsewhere. It's slasher, it's weird. I try to make it as weird as I possibly can. It's got nods to some of my favorite authors and creators, whether it's like a little bit of John Carpenter, who I'm a huge John Carpenter fan, or a little bit of Clive Barker as well, as one a huge influence on writing horror for me, writing sort of weird horror, body horror as well. So there's a little bit of everything that I love in this story, and it's also at its heart. Somebody else pointed this out to me, so I won't take credit for it, but they're like, you end with this story about, you start out with the collection writing these stories about family, and you end with this brother and sister relationship at the end of the story. It's a twisted one. It's about a slasher and a final girl who are brother and sister, but it's still kind of this family tale at the end of it. So I'd say if I had to pick a favorite, that's the one, but I also love all the other ones.
That's fair enough. I find that the things that I love writing, or I loved writing the most, were also the hardest to write. Would you agree that that was probably the most difficult one to write?
That one, it was. It's one that is, I think it's one of the longest in the collection. It's also just kind of, there's a lot of elements to it, like just getting that right, getting it to be like the right length, where doesn't overstay its welcome, but it does what I want it to do. That's always a challenge, right? It's like writing short fiction is like, I want it to be long enough to get my point across, but short enough that I can sell it to somebody, hopefully. And in the case of this one, just pop it in my collection.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is kind of like the bread and butter of a short story writer, is knowing how much you can pack into a very small package. And I know, like, I looked at your backlist. You've got some novelettes, you've got short stories all over the place. Are you looking at writing a full length novel work?
Yeah. So there's Abducted is the one I'm contracted right now with Dark Matter Inc., and that is kind of a alien abduction. I describe it as like X-Files meets Gone Girl in Fargo.
Oh wow, okay. I'm sold.
So
That
it's a
sounds great.
little bit of mystery, a little bit of aliens, and a little bit of kind of small town kookiness, I guess you would say, plus a lot of violence.
Ooh, that sounds a little bit like Hollow Things, or I think that's what it's called, like a Holocrime or something like that. That I did not expect that to be my jam, so I think that will also be my jam, and I'm very much looking forward to that.
Holocrime, that's the Andy Davidson one.
Yeah, that was
great.
So my last question, since we are in a bookstore, I want to know what you're reading right now.
What am I reading right now? I am reading Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grim Scribe by Thomas Ligotti. I had a lot of horror writer friends who got on me about needing to read Ligotti, so I'm finally getting my Ligotti on. I also started The Shining, which I'd never read. I've read a bunch of other Stephen King, but I just love The Shining because I've seen the Kubrick, and I know it's very different. I know he has very strong opinions about it. So I'm reading that, and then I think that. Oh, and then I also got that new McSweeney's The Horror issue that
Okay.
Brian Evanson edited, and so far it's fantastic. Packaging, I love like packaging. I love packaging so much, and this one's like, it's got a triple slipcase, and this is black bound. It looks like a Gideon's Bible or something on the inside.
Oh wow.
Oh.
That's cool. I have a copy of another book like that. It's called it's by Christopher Moore. It's Lamb, the Gospel According to Christ's Childhood Pal, and it looks like a Bible.
Oh,
I
love it.
Love it. It's so great. Anyway, so I'm gonna open it up to questions from the audience. If you guys have anything you want to know about the collection. Oh, come on. There's got to be one. Just one, even if it's a silly question. You got a question? You want to ask something just for funsies?
Gotta think.
Okay, I have a
sorry, go ahead.
Did you have like a work that you kept going back to at all, or something that you kept thinking about, like a piece of literature or something like that while you were like putting this collection together to kind of like weave those components together,
Yeah.
or like something that you referenced?
I think one of the an author that it's a friend, Gordon B. White, is an author. He's in Pacific Northwest, I believe, and his collection, As Summer's Mask Slips. I really enjoyed that collection. I really enjoyed the flow of it. It has a mix of short flash pieces and longer pieces, and it's got a little bit of everything. And my what I did was I went to Gordon and I said, how did you do this? It's just like the best advice I'd ever give anybody is just like, if you find something that works, like just go to somebody. And a lot of people are very generous with their time, thank goodness, and like very open with talking process, and Gordon was one of those people. And he said, you got to think of it as controlling the reader in a way, and like going through these moods of like highs and lows, shorts and fast and deep, and letting them sit with the piece for a while. And I thought a lot about that and about that collection when I was putting this together, because I was like, these are just good guiding principles, and it's something that when I'm working on the next collection, hopefully, knock on wood, that's gonna stick with me. It's just that notion of like putting it together, not just thinking of it as a collection of stories, but thinking of it as a piece, as a whole piece, really, and how it all fits together.
Awesome.
Alright, my question is, I was thinking about what you were saying earlier about how horror gives you a safe place to be scared. Why do you want that? Like, I don't seek out, personally, but obviously it's a huge popular genre, people like it, and I'm not one of those people, as you know, but
Yes.
yes.
My wife Jenna, everyone.
Why do you want a safe space to be scared? Why do you want to be scared?
That's a good question.
I think I'm a very anxious person. Yeah, that's true.
It's a
And
great thing, it's fine.
what I find is there's like a relief valve that comes with horror, with exploring these emotional states, seeing characters go through them and seeing how they deal with problems, or like, I'm not necessarily being chased by like a tentacle god from another dimension or anything, not usually, but it'd be kind of cool. But you can relate it to, I don't know, the stress of like getting the kids ready in the morning, or like being late for an appointment or something like that, and you see it in this like extreme, almost silly way, and that can kind of help you process it a little bit. It's just that emotional relief valve for me.
I would also like to add, I heard recently, and I don't know if this is true, so fact check me, that being scared is good for your health because it gives your heart a little jolt a little bit, keeps you, kind of going. But I also find, on a more serious note, that I was not a horror writer when I first started writing at all. I kind of found my way to it by being guided there. And I find that it is a really good place to talk about really difficult things. My two books, number one is about it's about familial trauma and breaking cycles, and then my second book is about postpartum depression. And it's a really good place to talk about those things because you go into horror expecting to be uncomfortable. So whenever you come across those really difficult to talk about topics, you're already uncomfortable, so you can wade in having felt like you're prepared to do that. And I think horror is a really great place for those kinds of things, especially.
Yeah, look at the biggest name in the genre, Stephen King. He's done, his therapy session was his books. They get bigger as he's working through more and more issues, I feel like, sometimes. So like it's in the DNA of the genre, I feel like, especially the contemporary modern version.
Yeah, I've always said that I write because therapy is expensive.
That's fair.
So, yeah. Well, thank you for sitting down with me. This was really great. This was
so
a
wonderful.
really good collection. I'm very excited to see what you come out with next because I'm not normally a short story reader, so I was very excited to find that I loved these.
Wonderful.
Really great.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everybody for coming, and I think we're gonna head up front to stand there awkwardly.